Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you so much to Vialto for supporting this event on migration policy, focusing on what needs to change in migration policy to spur on economic growth and to support workers' rights. Really grateful to have a great set of speakers today, and thank you, everyone, for coming to join us. Stephen Kinnock is on his way over from the conference hall and hopefully will be joining us very shortly. We've got a really great range of perspectives today on our panel. I'll just briefly introduce everyone. First of all, my name is Marley from IPPR. I'm Associate Director for Migration. And we've got a range of great speakers. First of all, introduce Andrea Alves on my right, who's Director and Solicitor at Vialto, specialising in UK immigration law. It's worth saying that Vialto, if you haven't heard of it, is a company which exists to help big and small employers move skilled people around the world by helping them with immigration, tax advice related to their move. And Andrea is a real expert on immigration policy. We've known each other for a long time. She's done a real range of fascinating work looking at immigration policy, particularly on issues like skill shortages and immigration challenges faced by business. And I think these are some of the key questions I think that government will want to be looking to in the next few years. Second, Stephen Bush on my left, Associate Editor and columnist at the Financial Times, who has often written very thoughtfully on immigration over the years. Looking really forward to hearing his perspective. And then Andrew Giles on my left, who is Minister for Immigration, Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs in the Australian Labor government. And I think it'd be really fascinating to hear from Andrew because there's so many parallels between migration policy and politics in the UK and in Australia, and lots of learning, I think, to be had. So we're looking forward to hearing what he has to say. And of course, Stephen Kinnock will be here shortly, Shadow Minister for Immigration. So we'll kick off, if it's okay, with Andrea, and it'd be great to get your thoughts on the big question about the role of immigration policy in economic prosperity and in supporting workers' rights.
Thank you, and thank you for my introduction. I wanted to start out by saying that my pronouns are she and her because I think it's really important, so I just wanted to start with that. So it felt like a real full circle moment for me when I read the title of this event. And this is because my father, Eric Alves, who's watching on streaming, was a rum blender in Barbados in 1962 when the UK ran a targeted advertising campaign in the Caribbean to recruit for Transport for London. When he arrived, he worked on the buses before switching to the post office and then becoming an electrician. My mother, Joan Alves, was a teacher in St Vincent, and in 1969, she saw another targeted advertising campaign for the NHS and came to the UK and stayed nursing in the NHS for 40 years. They met here, had me, and my brothers and sisters. So you can see why it's a real full circle moment for me to be here talking about how the immigration system can better support prosperity. So nowadays, whilst the UK continues to advertise abroad for certain sectors, the rules, as we know, have changed significantly. Non-UK nationals wishing to come to the UK, they now need a job offer. That job has to be recognised as skilled, and they have to be paid a minimum salary set out in the immigration rules. Employers wanting to recruit from abroad can no longer do a targeted advertising campaign with an English and maths test like they did back then. They have to apply for what's called a sponsor licence, and they do this by providing mandatory documentation to the Home Office. For example, they have to provide VAT registration, a UK bank account, along with other documentation. Their application is then considered, and if granted, they're given a number of work permits that they can give to individuals that meet the relevant criteria, as well as the salary criteria. The cost of a 3-year work permit is approximately £7,000 for an individual, and for a couple who's coming with two children, it's £18,000. So you can see that that's not the first option that employers will go for because it's so expensive. By having a sponsor license, employers have to sign up to a really rigid compliance regime. For example, if a work permit holder misses a start date or changes their work location, this has to be reported to the Home Office within 10 working days. And there are many other compliance duties, and it also means that the Home Office can audit your policies and processes to see if they're compliant at any time. I speak with large and small employers, both of whom struggle to keep up with discharging their compliance duties. Large employers, they have teams of people who look after their sponsor license and sponsor compliance, whereas smaller companies, they really do struggle with the administrative burden of having to deal with compliance considerations whilst also being required to be the office manager, the health and safety warden, knowing all about tax, as well as knowing everything that sits under HR. So I think that from an immigration system, if we were to throw everything up in the air, businesses require 3 things from an immigration system. The first is a flexible immigration system that allows them to recruit for jobs of the future as businesses are continually innovating. Like, who knew that being a TikTok content creator would ever be a job? No one knew that a few years ago. And then also having the recognition of the ongoing in-depth work that some employers already do to address skill shortages in the UK, including working a lot with opportunity-challenged areas. And the third point is working in partnership with schools, colleges and universities so that the courses are fit for purpose. The proposed skills body will address some of those ongoing challenges to ensure that businesses have what they need to prosper, but there's more to be done here. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. Stephen, on my left, I should say, Stephen.
It really has changed if I'm on the left, but actually, so I think it's a really interesting panel question, partly because actually the 2 things aren't necessarily that well aligned. There are some cases where you can pursue both individual workers and migrant rights and prosperity, but there are obviously some cases where there are quite sharp trade-offs. We see that now with delivery drivers, right? They essentially, one of the causes of food price inflation is that goods drivers have become very hard to recruit as a result of the changes, and they're just very helpfully set out for us there. And there just is a straightforward trade-off there, right? Do you want that to be as it increasingly is, increasingly well-remunerated job in a very tight labour market, or do you want it to be a fairly low-paid job that is lots of people's first job in the UK? And there are difficulties to either one of those answers. I think the sort of central principles I would kind of usefully throw out, and I think are useful for the Labour Party to think about as it moves from having an immigration policy that is primarily about a defensive set of positions going into an election in which, you know, I'm yet to cover an election in which the Labour Party wants immigration to be front and centre, and I doubt that this one will be the first. Although I think the interesting thing is it will be the first one in which the Conservative Party also doesn't want immigration to be front and centre in an election campaign. But there are a couple of, I would say, quickish wins which achieve both. The shortage occupations list, and just that whole concept is one of the silliest bits of government policy around. It turns out that governments aren't very good at predicting the precise needs of a big, complex economy, and essentially the only thing that the shortage occupation list means is that you can advertise those roles for less than you would be able to advertise them for if they weren't on the shortage occupation list. Posts remain on there for a very long time, and it's neither useful for businesses, because it's a pain in the neck for them. It's not good for prosperity because you're advertising jobs at less than what they get. So I would say that's one area of mutual coming together. The other area is, of course, universities, where, it's interesting. We often don't think of people who work in universities as precarious, but they've actually discovered new frontiers of really bad labour market practices in higher education. And that is a drag on one of the things the UK does incredibly well, that drives our prosperity. And that is because the immigration system is still littered with kind of pre-Brexit cruft. You know, stuff which was put in there solely to try and manage voter opposition to the free movement of people by inserting sort of weird bits of arbitrary cruelty into the system. So not being able to work, limits on who you can bring over, all of which was about a doomed attempt to manage anxieties over the fact that you didn't have control of movement within the EEA. And all of that harms prosperity. It turns out a word I can't, in fact, say without a run-up. All of that is bad for individual workers, but mostly in this policy area, there is a very difficult set of trade-offs between those two things that you quite rightly want us to talk about and to care about.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Andrew, it'd be great to get your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Marley. And I'm going to start with where Stephen started and finished and say that I actually don't think there are trade-offs in terms of migration policy. And that really comes from how I see migration policy really as a facilitator rather than something which directs wider public policy outcomes, because I think the trade-offs you talk about aren't really properly the job of immigration. They relate to wider public policy decision-making, and the question is, can we build a migration system that facilitates those societal goals, or do we have one which lapses into being a vehicle which drives behaviours and incentivises behaviours which don't align with our sense of how the labour market should operate or how we secure the living standards for the future. So that would be my high-level response. In terms of how we go about having a migration system play this facilitative role, the first point I would make is not really a legal one or a policy one. It's about administrative certainty and efficiency. And I don't suggest that policy settings aren't unrelated to that. But I think that's something which is massively understated in public discourse around this. But when businesses come and speak to me, what they want is to know when the visas will be processed, often how much it will cost, and how quickly they will be turned around. And I've been Australia's Immigration Minister for 16 months. Probably the biggest issue I've confronted, other than managing the politics of asylum, has been the fact that I inherited about 1 million visas that were awaiting processing. I would say a combination of neglect from the former government and obviously the pressure points that build up over the pandemic. So having that administrative efficiency and certainty of high quality decision making, I believe, is the fundamental bedrock upon which a migration system that assists a more prosperous society and a more effective labour market is fundamental. On the skills lists, I think that's a challenge that we grapple with too. How do we find ways that enable the social licence for skilled migration to be maintained, for the community to have an understanding about how migration for work sits in the context of domestic skilling, training, and doesn't undercut terms and conditions is a really big question. We are working our way through it. We had 4 skills lists, none of which I think are tremendously helpful and often, apart from the issues that Stephen identified, tend to be lagging indicators. For example, we have a need for data scientists, and I suspect you do too. There isn't actually a code in our system that covers that work. That's one example of many. But I also would say that for social licence and instrumental reasons, dealing with concerns, real and perceived, about migrant worker exploitation is fundamental. And that has been a big focus of my work and our government's work, to better understand how people's visa precarity, people with uncertain rights to remain in the country, how they can be made less vulnerable to exploitation in the workplace, which is obviously bad for them, bad morally, but also has significant adverse consequences that flow across the labour market. A big focus for us has been flipping the regulatory onus away from the visa holder, the migrant, to the person engaging them. The other thing that we've tried to do in this and are still working our way through is to ensure that there is trust and confidence in the system, which involves separating the regulation of work from the regulation of visa status, putting in place an effective firewall. And we are hopeful and confident, particularly through a tripartite design process involving business and unions, that these are drivers that will eliminate migrant exploitation across the economy and also facilitate a more prosperous society through having skilled migration become complementary to the other engines of growth in our economy.
Brilliant, thank you, Andrew. There's lots to pick up on there, and I'm sure we'll discuss more. But yeah, I'll turn to Stephen on my right.
Thank you very much indeed, and many thanks to IPPR for putting on this very important session, because I think these are complex issues, and I don't think anyone has all the answers. So it's very, very helpful for me, and I'm sure I speak for the other panelists to hear different perspectives and views. And it's been absolutely great to have had some time today with Andrew. We've had a number of really interesting conversations, and I do think what's happening in Australia, whilst I think we both agree that importing lock, stock and barrel models from other countries never works, but there's definitely some lessons for us to learn here in terms of what's been happening in Australia. If we look at this question of the points-based system, I think there's two major challenges that need to be addressed. One is around how we make it work for our labour market and for our economy in a way that maximises growth and opportunity, and indeed feeds into, I suppose, that first key mission that Keir Starmer set out in his speech today about delivering the highest sustained growth in the G7. And immigration and the points-based system plays a really important role in that. So I think we have to think about it look at it through the lens of the economy. And then I think there's a very pressing issue around exploitation, as Andrew was just referring to, and how are we going to get much stronger regulation into our system, because I think it's clear that the abuse that we're seeing, the behaviour of unscrupulous employers, is increasingly becoming a problem. So if I take those two in order, we're actually in the process of conducting a review within the sort of shadow immigration team, if you like. We have consulted with industry and with trade unions and with civil society and with experts such as Marley, who's provided us with some very good input to our thinking. And we've sort of set an exam question, which is, how do we build a points-based system which feeds into the strengths of our economy and ensures that our economy gets the immigration that it needs, whilst also ensuring that employers step up and do their bit in terms of workforce planning, training, maximising opportunities for local homegrown talent. And that is the circle that we want to square effectively. That is the balance that we want to strike. We feel, I mean, it's worth remembering, of course, that it was a Labour government that introduced the points-based system in the first place. Prior to, whilst we, of course, had free movement of labour, that didn't count for EU citizens coming to the UK, but for non-EU citizens, we invented that points-based system. We didn't invent it, we innovated on it, based to some extent on input from Australia back even in the noughties. But we created that points-based system for non-EU citizens. And we are clear that we have to maintain it. Our front bench has been clear that we're not going back into the single market. If we did go back into the single market, that would almost certainly imply a return to free movement of labour, and we're clear that's not going to happen. So we've got to have a points-based system instead of free movement of labour, which applies globally, but which achieves the objectives that I set out. And I think that the current points-based system is a very, very blunt instrument. It's not really connected to any strategic thinking about how the role the labour market plays in our economy, how it should drive forward productivity, how it should drive up wages and standards and quality of life. Rather, it is just a tap that gets turned on and off, and if you're a sponsor employer, you can apply and you get the labour that you've applied for, if you can get the people to come and do the jobs that you want them to do. And there's no overarching strategy which says, well, what we really need is a proper dialogue between trade unions, business and government, with input from experts, and of course the Migration Advisory Committee plays a crucial role in all of this, to set out what it is you need in that sector, why you need immigration to deliver to that objective, and what you are doing to ensure that you don't just constantly reach for immigration in order to fulfill those positions. There has to be a balanced approach, which also shows that you've got a plan for developing and maximizing opportunities for homegrown talent. So that is the review, and I'm certainly looking forward to the conversations. We're very much in listening mode around how we can make that work effectively so it doesn't become a big bureaucratic nightmare or a box-ticking exercise, but where it's a real partnership between business, government and trade unions to deliver the workforce that we need, both now and going forward into the future. I do think it's worth reminding employers that are sponsor employers that it's a privilege to be a sponsor employer. It shouldn't just be seen as something you can pull off the shelf and tap into whenever you want to. And I think that privilege needs to be earned, and it should be earned on the basis of showing that you are a progressive employer, an employer that's committed to also growing your workforce in a way that's good for your local community, as well as being good for your business, and about driving, as I say, standards and wages up. So that's the exam question, actually, and that's we're currently taking that the inputs from key stakeholders and hoping to be able to produce a report with some recommendations in the not too distant future. The second element that I wanted to touch on is exploitation, because I think that there is a real risk. I mean, I think it's already happening, but it's potentially, just going to get worse and worse and worse, which is you've got unscrupulous employers who are prepared to exploit vulnerable people. You've got, particularly in seasonal agricultural workers and care sectors that are desperate for migrant labour, in the former case, particularly because of what's happened since the free movement of labour ended. And you've got unscrupulous agencies working in markets that are very opaque. There are 54 countries around the world from which we recruit overseas labour, and in some of those places, there's no doubt at all that there are unscrupulous agencies that are going out and recruiting people to come and do work in the UK, either in the care sector or in the seasonal workers sector. Construction is also another big problem, and there are often cases of bonded labour where people are being forced to pay for this agency to get them the visa, and then they spend a lot of their time paying that debt back, which often translates into a form of modern slavery. When preparing for some of the sessions I was doing today, I was looking at the agencies in government that are responsible for regulating the labour market, and it really is an alphabet soup. There's the Employment Agency Standards Inspectorate, there's the National Minimum Wage Unit, there's the Gangmasters Licensing Authority, there's the EHRC, the HSE, the Pensions Regulator, and local authorities. It is a complete and utter mess. So Labour has a nailed-on commitment that we will create a single enforcement body which will integrate these together. I'm not saying that it will be a single sort of monolithic body, because as Andrew has rightly pointed out, there's quite a big difference between regulating a labour market in the context of immigration and regulating a labour market in the context of people who are resident in this country on a standard basis. So I think we also, I think, need to be doing more to empower our consulates and embassies and high commissions in those 54 countries to be able to go out and check up on the agencies that are doing this recruitment. That requires much better coordination with the Home Office. As I see it, none of that coordination is just not taking place at all, and it really is quite chaotic. So I think two big pieces I would want to leave with you. One is about how do we develop a labour market which works with our immigration system in a way to deliver on our mission of becoming the highest growing, strongest growth economy in the G7. And the second is how do we regulate that so it protects workers' rights and drives standards and quality up rather than having a race to the bottom. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stephen. Great. I will shortly open up to questions from the audience. I just have a few questions for the panel myself first. So I'll start with you, Andrew. I'm just interested, Stephen mentioned earlier the shortage occupation list, and we saw from the Migration Advisory Committee last week criticising how that works and proposing, well, some quite ambitious reforms, in fact, even abolishing it altogether. I wondered, obviously you're working with businesses, you're dealing with this on a day-to-day basis. What's your perspective on the role of the short occupation list, and how do you think it should be reformed?
So I work quite closely with the MAC, and I think that the job that they've got is a really important one. I think that the changes that have been suggested by Labour would be welcomed, but it could go a step further by allowing businesses to also suggest what should be looked at, because of the continuing innovation that happens, and to your point around the data scientists. By the time it gets onto the requirement from business has already changed, and so having everybody working with one focus would be really helpful. And I think that the Home Office, giving them their dues, which is that they have been much better at engaging business, being more proactive by taking business through like the wider scale changes ahead of time, rather than it's that business hear about it at the same time that everybody else hears about it. But the shortage occupation list, as it stands, it does need to be more flexible. It needs to be more dynamic, and also recognise the fact that there is that continued innovation.
Interesting, thank you, Andrew. So I'll go to Andrew now, because I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. I mean, absolutely, there's some really important points there about ensuring that it's flexible and ensuring that you've got that flexibility in the occupational codes to ensure that you're capturing the right occupations that are in shortage. But there's also a risk, I think, of being captured by kind of business lobbyists as well. So I'd be interested in your thoughts about how you've managed that in Australia.
Yeah, look, I think the short answer will be we've tried where possible to put in place tripartite mechanisms. And we, shortly after coming into government, convened a Jobs and Skills Summit over 2 days with 100 delegates from the union movement, from business, from academia and civil society. And one of the key outputs was a decision to conduct a wide-scale review of our skilled migration system, which was delivered to government earlier this year, and I can exclusively reveal that I won't be revealing our government's response to it to this forum. I've been in a lot of trouble with the Minister for Home Affairs apart from anything else. But I think what we tried to do through that process was to work out those areas where there was a clear consensus and those areas where there was more work to be done. And I think, and I hope, that approach, the approach of deep engagement with the regular users of the system and those with a keen interest in it being functioning with integrity, is brought into our efforts, not just on system redesign, but on system operation too. And I guess that's the point I want to reiterate again. The policy settings, of course, matter, but how they are administered and how they are enforced, I think, is more fundamentally important in a day-to-day sense for the things that we are talking about today.
Absolutely. Thank you. Stephen, on my left, Stephen, I'm interested in your thoughts on the kind of the points on trade-offs. And I definitely agree that there are trade-offs. I'd be interested in your thoughts on the politics of net migration, which have become increasingly dominant again, I think, in the last year or so. It's a very crude way of measuring migration, but it's a very simple way, and it dominates the political debate. I think it's likely to in future as well. So how do you think that political parties should navigate that big question?
In general, I don't think political parties should have targets for things where they don't control both levers. Ultimately, on the net migration target, you barely control one of the levers, right? Why is it so high at the moment? Well, one, because as anyone who is a friend or a relative of a doctor or a nurse will know, plenty of people in the NHS have decided to go and work in Australia and New Zealand, which obviously the government would like to stop. Well, the government purportedly would like to stop, although it does sometimes feel like Steve Barclay, are you guys paying him under the table? It would explain quite a... It would explain quite a lot if you were, right? But, sorry, what was
the number.
The net migration.
Right, So, and equally, the British government can't control if Vladimir Putin decides to invade Ukraine, or if the Hong Kong's government is coerced into passing a repressive set of anti-freedom measures. So it's not a good idea to have the target full stop. Now, I actually don't think that we have really seen the return of the politics we saw in the noughties. We've seen the politics of the Conservative core vote getting very upset about a failure the Conservative Party keeps talking up But actually, if you think about the politics of that in the noughties, 90s, because broadly speaking, the history of British immigration policy is wave of change, and then there is a social and political reaction. Rise of the organised far right, violence in Notting Hill in the 50s and 60s, rise of UKIP in the noughties and 90s. What we're seeing this time is we're seeing a bunch of the core Conservative vote getting very angry on Facebook, but we aren't seeing the social consequences that we saw in the same way. I suspect that's partly because actually a way that the UK immigration system does now work fairly well is that none of this migration is that new, right? Like ultimately, there being some more prosperous Christian West Africans in South London is not a big change in the culture of the that's not an integration challenge in the way that it was in the 50s and 60s when you had people coming here from the West Indies. So I don't think we are in quite the same place, because I think what is acute for swing voters and the voters that the Labour Party should be concerned with is actual social change. And the immigration we're seeing now does not represent actual social change. It's going to be a big problem for the Conservatives in opposition, because the voters they fear losing to parties of their right are simply concerned with diversity and dark skin, right? And that is going to be one of the things which is going to be quite grim when they do go into opposition, because they're going to feel really pulled, and it's going to be superficially very attractive, and they're not going to have to keep the economy running anymore. So, I imagine they will probably end up with a net immigration target, than actually want numbers to go down, because the thing which constrains that right now, Suella gives her speech, and then one of the spending department goes, can I please have some more open labour market? So that will get much more grim, I think, if Labour wins the next election.
Thank you. And Stephen, Stephen just mentioned at the start there about kind of health and care sector in particular, and I wondered your thoughts. We know that a lot of the work visas at the moment, the increase in work visas, is driven by health and care in particular, and most recently, actually, care workers, where we know there's a particular risk of exploitation. I wondered if you had any thoughts, given that's going to be perhaps the big part of the immigration system to kind of think about for any government. What would your approach be when it comes to health and care visas?
Yeah, the health and care sector is a classic example of why immigration is such a complex issue, because it cuts across so many other departmental briefs. And on the health and care piece, that is particularly because most care homes and care companies have contracts with local authorities to provide that social care, and those contracts are invariably based on the minimum wage. So you could well say, look, we're going to scrap the shortage occupation list for the care sector and drive wages up. We're very clear, by the way, that we want to scrap the 20% discount rate. That is formal Labour Party policy, and I'm pretty sure the government is going to end up following our lead on that. But the big challenge then is, what do you do about the local authorities whose budgets have been completely whittled away over the years of austerity? So you actually need a very joined up approach on this, where we clearly need to drive terms and conditions up. We have got our new deal for workers. We want to have a new deal for the care sector, which is based, I think it needs to be based on, the national living wage. But the big question is, how do you get there in very constrained fiscal times? But I think the answer to your question is, we have to have an immigration system which is based on driving terms and conditions up, not undercutting. Once we're very clear on that, and once we're clear that we're ready to make that a priority, then I think your negotiation through your comprehensive spending review on what local government receives has to be based on a calculation of what they need to pay care workers at the national living wage. And in that way, you have a level playing field where everybody that you bring into the country is national living wage. There's no 20% discount, there's no undercutting, there's no shortage occupation list. There is the national living wage for people working in that sector. And it's on that basis you also ensure that you drive better harmony in the community, because there isn't a feeling amongst the local workforce that they're being undercut, and you drive up terms and conditions and quality of life for the people working in that sector. So my challenge as the Shadow Immigration Minister is, I can't speak for my colleagues in the Shadow Treasury team and in the Shadow DLUC team, but we clearly all need to come to an agreement which says our number one priority is to ensure that we have a labour market that works for working people.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Yeah, absolutely a really good example of needing to have joined-up government across multiple departments.
Exactly.
Great, I'll open up for questions. I think my colleagues are going to help with the roving mic. Thank you very much, Lucy. Should we go, for Alex, should we do them in groups of 3, I think, if that's all right, and then we can go back to the panel. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Alex. I'm the co-director of a new organization called Migrant Democracy Project, promoting migrant civic and democratic engagement in the UK. And I'm also a Labour local councillor in a county council where we have 3 asylum hotels at the moment. So I'm asking 2 short questions from one of my county councillor hat on. We have, as I said, 3 asylum hotels in Cambridgeshire County. And I visited them where we actually provide English classes in one of the hotels. And it's really heartbreaking to see how people have been waiting for such a long time, and they have such very few activities to do because they don't have the right to work. And I want to reflect on this comparison with Australia, where asylum seekers do have access to work. And moving the question to Stephen now, would Labour reconsider this policy, because it is actually very damaging long-term in terms of the impact on local authority and the impact of national policy on the local area, where people have been waiting for 1-2 years and don't have access to work, when most of them, let's face it, will be accepted and will be living communities after. So, and actually some of them will be de-skilled or lose their skills because they can't practice their skills or their English that they're learning in this time. And the second question is that there are around 1 million residents in England and Northern Ireland who have no formal democratic rights, so they don't have the right to vote, not even locally. And I'm not sure if this policy changed, but I know that in Australia, at least at one time when I was researching this, at the local council level, it's based on residence rather than where someone happens to be born. Of course, it's the same in Scotland and Wales. So again, looking at the local level, are migrants' civic and democratic rights reconsidered, at least at the local level, where everyone pays the same council tax and contributes in the same way based on residence rather than your passport? Thank you.
Thank you. The person just there, sorry, I can't quite see who they are, but just right there, exactly.
Hi, thank you. I'm Asmita Sood, Policy Campaigns and Partnerships Manager at Southall Black Sisters. We're based in West London and we work with migrant victims of domestic abuse and honour-based violence. Over 60% of our service users have no recourse to public funds. Now, I want to ask you, Stephen, about what you said about exploitation. Given that migrant victims of abuse, not just domestic abuse, but various forms of exploitation, have no recourse to public funds, which means they'll be turned away from refuges, shelters, will have no state support whatsoever, and will have to choose between poverty and deportation, being abused and being deported, and just continuing within those cycles of exploitations. Will you commit to support provisions, crucial support provisions, which have the unanimous support of frontline organizations in the violence against women sector, in the migration sector, which include abolishing no recourse to public funds and introducing a firewall on data sharing between the police and immigration enforcement?
Great, thank you. And just the gentleman just on the left. I'll make sure to go over to this side later.
So, Adrian Williamson, Society of Labour Lawyers. Andrew briefly mentioned trade unions, but that was, I think, the only mention from the panel. Isn't strengthening trade unions an essential part of both protecting immigrant labour and ensuring that non-immigrant labour does not feel undercut or exploited by the arrival of immigrants?
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so we've got questions on right to work, on no recourse to public funds, and on undercutting. Does anyone want to kick off with a thought?
Can I just jump in with a very quick point, which is that there's an organisation called Talent Beyond Boundaries, and this organisation is something that corporates are increasingly going to to recruit refugees from overseas to come to the UK, and they immediately will have the right to work, and they're also fast-tracked through getting a skilled worker visa. So I just wanted to say that from an employment perspective. But I think the rest of the questions are for you guys. So.
On right to work, right, that is a classic example of that. Why did the last Labour government take away the right for people to work while they were having their asylum claims processed? Well, it was because they knew they had a political problem with the free movement of people and with asylum that they couldn't solve, so they decided to do an ostentatious bit of cruelty as a kind of, oh, well, you know, look, we're still in the EEA, but don't worry, we've made an unrelated group of people slightly more miserable. As you don't need me to tell you, it's terrible for the people in going through the process. It's terrible for the local economy. I do think it is a classic thing that either party should now do as a way to help it out of some of their own self-inflicted problems, because ultimately there is a reason why everyone hates having these hotels in their constituencies. It's because it blows a hole in your local economy and it's miserable for everyone involved. So it just, I think, is something that someone should get rid of very soon.
Great, thank you. I don't know, maybe before going to Stephen, it'd be interesting, Andrew, to get your thoughts. I mean, obviously you can't speak for the UK, but some of those policies, I think, are relevant in the Australian context. Obviously, Alex mentioned right to work. I mean, also the point about firewall, you mentioned the firewall there between labour enforcement agencies earlier. It'd be good to get your thoughts on how those work.
And look, I should just say on the trade unions, I think I mentioned them 4 times, and I probably said tripartite quite a few times as well. And I think it was entirely consistent with how Stephen was responding, with the sense that what we should be trying to do with a migration system that works is to not disrupt our broader vision for the labour market, providing a fair deal for everyone in it, regardless of their visa status. So that'd be my brief response to that proposition. I think on the firewall question, whether it's around supporting victim survivors of family and domestic violence, or people who are receiving appalling treatment in the workplace, the principle is the same. We need to recognise the risk that attaches to having a contingent visa status at every level, and obviously a sense of confidence that your visa vulnerability will not be used against you when you make a report under some other provision is fundamental. I'd make the wider point, which I should have made earlier, that our government's vision for our migration system is built on removing the contingency. We want more people to have clearer pathways to permanency in our country, and that's why citizenship is in my title. It's how our country is built. And I think that's something that I probably should have touched on earlier. If we want to deal with contingency, we can deal with that by removing the contingency from the visa holder at an appropriate stage. On the last part of the question, which is, I think, the work rights one, I mean, this has been, again, an issue which has been subject of political contest in Australia, and no doubt will continue to be. I think we've long had a difference in how the settlement of humanitarian interests takes place, and by and large also the circumstances under which they arrive. People who come to Australia and seek asylum almost, well, in recent years exclusively, are people who have arrived on a valid visa and subsequently seek to claim protection. It's a pretty different set of circumstances than that which characterises the current UK debate. Or alternatively, they come here through a humanitarian pathway, and in either circumstance, some of the ills, whether they're political or practical, that are the subject of the UK debate don't really apply. The other point, I think, is the scale of the problem that has been put in place by a failure to process and a failure to either progress into refugee status or through removal where safe to do so, makes the issue, I think, so distinct from Australia that the comparison, I don't think, is terribly helpful. That's a very long non-answer, isn't it?
Yeah, thanks, Marley. Alex, on right to work, one thing I think we do need to just remind ourselves of is that back in 2017, the Conservative government quietly dropped the service standard that all asylum applications should be processed within 6 months. Now, you know, that is actually the way to address the issue around the backlog, is to have that service standard in place. You may have seen that Labour's announced our new policy of surging 1,250 caseworkers and decision makers to the Home Office. We've also want to increase the number of immigration enforcement officers by 1,000. How the Shadow Home Affairs team managed to get the Shadow Treasury team to agree to this commitment, I still haven't quite figured out how we did that, but I'm very pleased that we did. I think it reflects just how important we see this issue as being around the backlog. And of course, it's an investment that would pay for itself very rapidly, because we're currently paying £8 million a day to have asylum seekers languishing in hotels. So the question around right to work, if we could have a service standard of a 6-month processing, I think the right to work question would be far less salient. It is very interesting to hear about the Australian case, as you mentioned, the fact that asylum seekers are able to work from day one. Our current Labour Party policy, frontbench policy, is that asylum seekers should be able to work after 12 months on the shortage occupation list. And I have no doubt at all that many people in this room won't agree with that position. But as things stand, we feel that we want to really keep the focus on getting those claims processed in a maximum of 6 months. And I think that that is then when you grant the leave to remain, and people who've received leave to remain can get a job and get on with their lives and move forward. And we feel that's the best way to address it. I think you also asked about right to vote and citizenship questions. Were we specifically talking about asylum seekers' right to vote, or?
No, residents-based voting rights, Scotland and Wales, all residents or local residents can vote in all the local and local elections in Scotland and Wales.
Right, okay, yes. So for local, I was going to say local and European elections, of course, that's what it used to be. So aligning those rights around local elections, but you're not suggesting for national general elections?
Well, there was an amendment to the elections bill on national as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a very, very interesting question. I'm afraid I'm going to not give you an answer to that, because I think we do need to go away and think about some of these things. But there is a Rubicon in our system, which is that UK citizens get to vote in general elections, residents get to vote in local elections. I think there's a strong and compelling case that you make around residents being allowed to vote in local elections. So a lot of this is still, being thought through, and I think you make a very good point, certainly around local elections. I'm not so sure about general elections, because that's quite a big Rubicon to cross. For asthma, no recourse to public funds, that is something that's going to have to go into the mix in terms of, if we do manage to win the general election and we look at the state of the public finances, we will then make commitments, because there are, of course, financial implications around abolishing NRPF. So I think that's something that we need to look at very, very carefully. But I'm afraid I'm going to give you a bit of a politician's answer again on that, which is that prior to a general election, it's very difficult for us to be able to make spending commitments like that before we really see the state of the public finances. I think the point I made earlier about immigration enforcement, a really important piece of that is this firewall between labour market enforcement for people who are resident in the UK and labour market enforcement in the context of immigration. It's very important, because there are so many people who are afraid of blowing the whistle and reporting cases of abuse, because they then fear deportation themselves. So we've got to ensure that whistleblowers are given the space and the confidence to be able to do that and to report abuses to the authorities without the fear of being deported. So that's why the firewall, there's many reasons why that firewall is so important. But I do think we can't continue with what I call the alphabet soup of all these different agencies that are cutting across each other and not working in an integrated way. So we're committed to a single enforcement body, but within that single enforcement body, we have to have very clear methodology for managing the immigration piece vis-a-vis the resident labour, resident worker piece. And just to echo on trade unions, I'm sorry, maybe I should have made it a bit clearer. I did try and say in my comments about the way in which we're thinking about the points-based system is, in essence, we're looking at a sector-by-sector approach based on constructive dialogue between business, trade unions and government, so that you can define your sectoral work plans. I don't want this to be a bureaucratic nightmare for businesses. I don't want it to be, a box-ticking exercise. But I do think that there's a really big opportunity to have a much better understanding of, at a sectoral level, what are the needs of the sector going forward? What are the trade unions saying about that? How do we ensure that the sector gets the immigration it needs, but that employers are also doing their bit and investing in training in the workforce? And of course, job centres play a really important role in this as well. And there's also a hugely important piece around the fact that we've got something like 2.5 million people currently on long-term sick leave. I mean, that's a huge local labour market resource that isn't being tapped into. So again, an example of how immigration cuts across, we've talked about it cutting across into local government. It cuts across also into the health service, into DWP, around, job centres and the role they play in ensuring that you're maximising your engagement with your local labour market. So trade unions play an absolutely crucial role in this, and they would be put front and centre of our new approach to the points-based system.
Great, thank you, Stephen. And yeah, something that we're looking at IPPR is sort of international examples of how trade unions, I think, play a much greater role in other systems in terms of ensuring high standards within the skilled worker system. So that's something we want to look at and see how it could work in the UK context too. Great. One last round of questions, and then we have to wrap up. We could go to Chris in the back.
Hi there, thanks very much. Chris Murray, the Labour candidate in Edinburgh East and Musselburgh, and former IPPR Migration Research Fellow. One of the things we know about the UK is that we have got really big regional inequalities and different economic situations in the different nations and regions of the UK, and also different immigration stories as well. You know, the experience of London versus the northeast of England versus somewhere like Scotland is really different. So the question is, how far can we use the immigration system to address those issues? And can we do that without adding to the regulatory burden that we add to businesses that Andrea was outlining? Thanks.
Just woman there. Well, maybe woman at the front and then the woman behind her. And then we lose the two.
Hi, Sasha Aldridge from Burkett's law firm. So I'm kind of interested, at the moment we've got an almost entirely sponsor-led immigration system, whether you're sponsored by family, by your university, or by business. And my question really is, do we think that's the right model going forward, or is that something that we can diversify on the basis that from a compliance perspective, we've now got more businesses than ever signed up to be sponsors that potentially are overwhelmed by that responsibility, with many SMEs doing it, but also from an innovation perspective, lots of industries, we have a gig economy, self-employed persons that just cannot access the immigration system and cannot access the UK and bring their productivity and innovation to the UK. So do we want a genuine Australian points-based system where it's based on skills, age, region, to help address some of those issues in tandem with a business-led sponsor system?
And the woman at the front, I think you had a question.
Hello, my name's Jane Cutler, and I'm from Buckingham CLP. Andrew, I was on the other side of this debate when in 1975 my family and I were £10 POMs. So £10 POMs, we paid £10, and we flew over to Australia at the government's mostly expense, and my husband started working in Adelaide. Now, a criteria for moving there was we needed £12,000 to take with us, which was a hell of a lot of money in 1975. We were able to buy a house in a nice suburb, and it worked out reasonably successfully. But my concern is with the welfare of people coming to this area, or this country, because where I live in the south of England, for every one-bedroom house or apartment, there are 20 people queuing up. How are these people going to get accommodation for a start? And will they be resented by the locals? I'm really concerned that they're going to be happy when they come here, because at the moment, many people who migrate to Australia, quite a proportion do come back. And I feel we want to make people happy here, so they stay, having invested in them.
Thank you so much. Great. Who would like to start with any responses?
I can go first again because mine's going to be really short.
Of course.
I just wanted to say that I think that the new system, any new system that we have, it does need to be dynamic. We now have remote working, the gig economy, hybrid working, and our immigration system at present just isn't flexible enough for this. And companies, they thrive on having diversity of thought, having different voices and lived experiences, and that can only enhance the success of businesses. So I think that really should be looked at going forwards.
Excellent, thank you, Andrea. Anyone else want to come in? I mean, I know, Andrew, your experience of kind of regional migration policy would be interesting to...
My mother came from Shropshire to Melbourne in 1971. I think she's reasonably happy with the decision, but we'll have to check in on that. I mean, one thing that I don't think is said enough in our migration debate, and maybe this one too, is rather than look at the needs of our labour market, to think about the decisions of the prospective migrant. And I think that's something that has to be more central in this debate. What are the things that shape someone's decision, whether they're in the migration system or otherwise? And obviously access to affordable housing and high quality social infrastructure is important in a settlement journey, but it's also important in terms of a social licence for a migration program. And I guess that takes me to the regional question too, Chris. I think it'd be fair to say that we haven't got this right in Australia, and I think there are similar dynamics about the interaction, not just between the places that we find that migrants want to go, and that tends to be Melbourne and Sydney, and the places where perhaps governments would like migrants to go, more dispersed areas, particularly for some of those skills like GPs, for example. I think, again, not so much looking at the incentives in the migration system, which has been our traditional approach. You move to a regional area, you get a quicker pathway to permanent residency and citizenship. I think that allows us to fill labour market gaps, but the history is that quite often people, when they get their permanent residency, go to Melbourne and Sydney. And that creates a sense of dislocation in the community as well as frustration on the part of the migrant. So I think we've got to, again, build a migration system that's facilitative rather than determinative, and try and identify better matching between labour market needs that are desired to be filled through the migration system and what might cause someone to put down roots in a particular community rather than a particular country. And I think there are some good examples of practice there, but I think we're a bit underdone in that respect, I would say. And Sasha, I do love genuine Australian-based system, because almost every time when I read about an Australian style approach in the UK press, it doesn't reflect my understanding of our policy making. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's just a shorthand that is convenient. I think our friends in Treasury, and probably Stephen, your friends in the Shadow Treasury team, are pretty keen on sponsorship, because that delivers a pretty good fiscal dividend. But certainly, if you look at how we structure our program, as you obviously know, it isn't solely about pathways through sponsorship. The skills-based system, which I think could do with a bit more work, is about an independent approach to skilled migration, and I think that also needs to be a feature of our program.
Thank you, Andrew. Really appreciate it. As we're running out of time, I want to very quickly go around the panel just to get some very final thoughts, and perhaps just as a useful way of focusing the final comment, just maybe a kind of the top priority for you for kind of changing our immigration system, maybe with an exception for you, Andrew, about the priority for you changing the Australian immigration system, given you're currently in government. Or maybe we can go. We'll start again with Andrew. Should we go for
I think from my perspective, it would really be around listening to businesses and distinguishing big businesses from medium-sized to small businesses and not having a one-size-fits-all, because big businesses do so much to try and engage their local communities, as well as have lots and lots of initiatives to upskill people within the area, as well as people within the workforce whose jobs have now been moved on to automation and things like that. And sometimes they're kind of like, you know, hit with a stick when they're doing so much to try and achieve the aims overall. So that would be my final thought.
Thank you. Stephen?
Yeah, I think the central priority for you know, all of you, assuming that those of you who aren't journalists, the only reason you'd voluntarily be here is if you're either in the Labour Party or interested in immigration policy, isn't the broad problem in the politics of immigration is it's been solely refracted through like electoral concerns and through concerns solely focused on immigration. But the way to get a better immigration policy is to think about it in terms of what does this mean for our skill shortage? I mean, you're exactly right that we're not open enough to entrepreneurs, but also we essentially are a country where firms start up and then list in New York. And I think these two things are linked. And I think the big thing I would plea on the next government, whoever it will be, spoiler alert, Labour, it would be to free immigration policy from being in this black box in which only immigration is considered and talked about.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Andrew, your priorities in Australia?
I'd like to be responsible for a migration system that is working and seen to be working in the national interest, and it is a reflection of who we are. My country is and sees itself as a majority migrant nation, a country that's continually being made and remade by an immigration system that people can navigate their way through, that's premised on pathways to permanency and full involvement in the Australian community. And I think that underpins both questions we've been asked to address. An attractive product for people who are going to drive a more productive economy that will sustain our living standards into the future, and a labour market that will operate equally for people regardless of their visa status.
Thank you, Andrew. And yeah, as Stephen said, you can't obviously import policies across countries, but I think it is remarkable how many parallels there are in the kind of policy and political debate at the moment between Australia and the UK, so thank you. And finally, last word to you, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been a really, really fascinating discussion. I suppose I'd maybe, at the risk of sounding pompous, I mean, we have to remember, we talk a lot about immigration in conversations like this as part of a labour market strategy, almost a bit like, sometimes sounds a bit like numbers on a spreadsheet. We have to remember that these are people. These are not commodities. These are real people with real lives and real families who want to come to the UK, and we should be very proud that people want to come to our country. And we should ensure that we have an immigration system that is well managed. We haven't talked about asylum today, we've touched on it, and particularly in the case of asylum, that is based on competence and control, but also on compassion. And I think it's that desire to have a system that works for our economy should not just be driven by a desire to drive up our prosperity, it should also be driven by a desire to have a more diverse and thriving and vibrant society and culture. And we derive our strength from that. And that, I think, always has to be remembered, that this is not in any way a burden that we have to bear. It is something we should be proud of, and that we should absolutely harness that energy that we get from diverse companies are the companies that are the most profitable, the most successful, and the most competitive, and the most productive. And we should be very proud of the amazing input that we've had from other parts of the world, helping us with our thinking and our innovating in terms of our economy, and also enriching our societies. But we need an immigration system to deliver that. We also need an integration system that delivers that. So we've got to look at pathways to citizenship. We've got to look at ensuring that the social infrastructure is in place so that we aren't creating concerns in a community about housing, because there's already huge pressures on housing or on getting an appointment at the GP surgery or on class sizes. Because if you don't get the social infrastructure piece right, you will leave the ground open to the hard right divisive rhetoric that we are seeing from the likes of our Home Secretary, who is using this issue as a way of setting communities against each other. So we've got to get the social infrastructure and integration piece right in all of this, because that will not only ensure that people who do come to our country feel welcome and feel that they can hit the ground running and be a part of British society and our economy, but it also takes all of the wind out of the sails of the nasty and divisive rhetoric that we're seeing from this government. So that's a win-win, and I hope that we can always remember, though, that this is real people with real lives, and we should be proud of the fact that they want to come to our country.
Thank you, Stephen, and thanks so much for everyone for joining and participating today on the panel. Have a great rest of the conference.